Oftentimes people will ask questions like, what is the best exercise for running faster? What's the best workout? And those questions are just they're not very well thought out. I think you need to think about what is the best exercise for me based on the qualities that I have and the qualities I don't have if I want to get better. So in order to assess that, there's various tests that you can do. And today we're going to talk about tests that you can do on the track, tests that you can do related to jumping, and then some things you can do in the gym to try and assess what it is that you need to work on. As far as sprint tests go, there's the 30-meter force velocity profile and there's the 30-meter flying sprint. Now with the force velocity profile, you'll set up cones every 5 meters. You'll film yourself sprinting over that 30-meter segment. Use the My Sprint app, plug in your times, and it'll give you information like how much horizontal force you're producing, what your ratio of force is, how your ratio of force decreases every 10 meters, and be able to assess whether you have a force deficit or a velocity deficit. If you have a force deficit, that typically means that your early acceleration is not as good, but your later acceleration is relatively better, and you can hit a relatively higher top speed even though your early acceleration isn't great. And if you have a velocity deficit, it's the opposite. Typically, these athletes will be pretty good accelerating early in the race, but they may not reach as high of a top speed as they're capable of. So you can then train in a way that targets whatever you're not as good at. So if you have a force deficit, maybe you work a little bit more on horizontal force production with resisted sprints, certain types of lifts, and then you retest 6 weeks later and see, did my force velocity profile improve? Is my force velocity profile more balanced? And did my time improve? Similarly, we can use a 30-meter flying sprint. You could do a 10-meter flying sprint if you just want to assess maximal velocity, somewhere between 10 and 20 meters. If you wanted to assess both maximal velocity and speed endurance, you could do a 30 or a 40-meter flying sprint. But either way, you want to look at not only what is the fastest split time that the athlete reaches, which you can then use to figure out their average velocity over that distance, so you can see how fast they actually are, but you can also see, does the athlete maintain their speed well and their technique over that flying sprint. So you might see an athlete who hits a really fast time, but the rest of their split times are not very good. That athlete probably needs to work more on speed endurance. Whereas if you have an athlete who's hitting pretty average split times, but they're able to maintain that over 30 or 40 meters, that athlete probably needs to work more on just getting faster overall because they're able to maintain their technique and their speed, but their speed itself is not high enough to be successful in the sprints. So with the flying sprint test, you can assess both top speed and speed endurance depending on how long you go. And when you look at both the force velocity profile, your 0 to 30 meter time, and then your flying sprints, you can start to assess, does the athlete need to work on early acceleration, mid acceleration, top speed or speed endurance? Do they need to work more on, being forceful, or do they need to work more on building velocity related qualities? Those different things can be assessed with these two tests, and this is where I would start when trying to assess yourself for how you can train to sprint faster. Next, we have two jumping tests. So we have the RSI, which is the reactive strength index, and then we have the reactive bounding coefficient test. For the RSI test, you can do it either as a single jump from like a drop jump, so you drop off a 12-inch box or something like that, hit the ground, jump up as quickly and as high as you can, and then you take the flight time divided by your contact time, and that'll give you your RSI. If your RSI is below 3, then you need to definitely improve it if you want to run fast, and you probably have to work on vertical stiffness qualities. If you're over 3.7 or 4, you're probably pretty good in the vertical stiffness department, and you just need to maintain those qualities rather than try to really dedicate a lot of effort to improving them. You can do the RSI either as that single hop test or that single jump test, like I said, like in a drop jump, or you can do it over multiple pogo hops or stiff ankle hops. So you do like 10 stiff ankle hops, you take the middle 6 or middle 8, and then you'd assess the RSI for each of those. You can get an average, a high number, and a low number, so you can once again see, can the athlete hit a high RSI, and are they able to do that repeatedly? If they can, then great. If their RSI is low, they need to work on vertical stiffness. If they can hit one good RSI or two, but then the rest are not very good, maybe they need to do more extensive pogo hopping to work on being able to maintain that RSI over multiple attempts. Then there's the reactive bounding coefficient test, which according to some research is a little bit better at predicting sprint performance, compared to the RSI test. With the reactive bounding coefficient, you'll do 10 bounds, and you'll take both the distance and the time, enter it into a simple calculation, and it'll basically show you how well you use the stretch shortening cycle when trying to move forward over the ground. If you can cover a long distance but it takes you a long time to get there, then that's great, but you probably need to work more on being quick while still covering a lot of ground. Similarly, if you can get through the 10 bounds very quickly but you don't go very far, then you need to work more on stride length, projection, and launching yourself down the track. So this can help you identify, do I need to work more on stride length? Do I need to work more on stride frequency? Maybe I need to work more on joint stiffness because I'm not able to transition off the ground very well. But the reactive bounding coefficient is another simple test that you can use to assess your abilities, and it's pretty good at predicting 30 meter, 50 meter sprint times, 10 to 30 and 30 to 50 meter flying sprints. So aside from the earliest part of the sprint, the 0 to 10, it has a pretty good correlation with sprint time. So something worth trying, especially if you haven't tested it ever before. Last, we have a couple tests that you can do in the gym. The first is a load velocity profile. So, we had the force velocity profile for sprinting, but in the gym we would do load velocity profiling. So you might take, if you have a really tall Smith machine, you could do it there, or you could do it with a bar. But basically you would take an empty bar, you would jump with the bar doing a squat jump, and then you would add load to the bar up to a certain point. Maybe you go from, just the bar, which is 45 pounds, up to, your body weight or something like that on the bar. And as you go through those jumps, you can then see how does the velocity change as I add load. And then you can graph that on a chart and look at the slope of the line. If you have a pretty linear change in velocity as you add load, then you probably have a pretty balanced load velocity profile. But if you find that you can jump relatively higher at heavier loads than you can at lighter loads, I'm not saying that that your absolute jump height is higher at the heavier loads, but if you don't have a linear change in your velocity or jump height as you add load, maybe you're just slightly better jumping with heavier loads than lighter loads. Maybe you need to work on lighter loaded rate of force development work to improve your ability of producing high velocities at lower loads. Whereas maybe you're the opposite. Maybe you're really good at jumping when you have 45 pounds or 90 pounds on the bar, but when you go up to 150 or 185 pounds, you can't jump off the ground at all. Maybe you're the type of athlete that just needs to focus on getting stronger because you're unable to, move very well when you have a little bit of load on your back. So the load velocity profile can help you assess what type of loading you need to use in your training. And if you combine that with the data you get from the force velocity profile or the reactive bounding coefficient test, you should be able to get a pretty clear idea of, do I need to work on generally heavier strength training, or do I need to focus a little bit more on lighter but really rapid rate of force development work in the gym? It's not that you're going to completely abandon either type of training, but you might just sort of shift your program to emphasize one quality over the other, using the loading as your way to manipulate how the workout is going to affect your body. Another thing we can do is isometric testing. So you can go on Amazon, get a crane scale, which is basically like a load cell. There's other ones you can buy that are more specific for athletes, but they're more expensive. You can get a crane scale for like $30 or $50 on Amazon. So to do isometric testing, the way I do it is I will anchor the crane scale to the bar or to the machine that I'm using tie downs like that you would strap down something in your truck with. And you could use chains as well, just anything that isn't going to move when you push against it. You then would push as hard as you can into the bar. You could do it standing, you could do it in a hip thrust. There's all kinds of variations you could do. You could do it on a calf raise. But you basically want to see what is the absolute maximum amount of force that I can put out with every joint, every leg, and that sort of thing. If you find that one of your legs produces much less force than the other at the ankle joint or the knee joint or the hip joint, then clearly you need to work on improving those asymmetries a little bit. Everybody will always have some asymmetry, so it's not that we're trying to get to 0%, but if you have a 20% difference in force production in your right ankle versus your left ankle, or your right hamstring versus your left hamstring, then that's going to cause issues, and it's going to limit your performance. So doing isometric testing can be a good way to identify which joints in your body need to be stronger? At what joint angles are they the strongest? What types of movements maybe you need to work on. For example, if in a single leg hip thrust you can produce almost no force, then clearly you need to work on the single leg hip thrust. Or if when you do an ankle isometric, you can only put out, 150 newtons of force, then clearly you need to get stronger in those joints. So being able to look at different joints with this, one leg versus the other, and assess how those different joints and different limbs are producing force, that can be pretty useful, and then you can apply that to your training. So as you go through these tests, you want to be looking at, what am I generally better at? What am I generally worse at? And if you do all of these tests, you don't have to do all of them, but if you do the 30-meter force velocity profile, you do some kind of flying sprint, there you're going to be able to assess your acceleration abilities, and not only the time that it took you to accelerate, but how are you getting to that time with that force velocity profile. And then you can go to work on those qualities that you need to develop based on what that information gives you. Similar with the 30-meter flying sprint, you can assess top speed, speed endurance, and see which do you need to work on more. Then when you do the jumping test, you can use RSI for vertical stiffness and sort of how quickly you can get off the ground relative to the height that you jump off of that ground contact. And then you can use the reactive bounding coefficient to look at how well do I use the stretch shortening cycle when moving in a horizontal direction, and identify, do I need to work more on stride length? Do I need to work more on stride frequency? Or maybe I need to work on stiffness. And as you look at the video and look at the results that you calculate, you can assess those things. Then when you go in the gym, you do a load velocity profile to see, am I relatively better at moving heavy weights or lighter weights? And if one of those is significantly off of a generally linear slope of as load increases, the velocity drops. If that slope is not linear, then maybe you need to work on one or the other. You need to work on heavier strength work. Maybe you need to work on lighter, more explosive work, or however you want to cut it. It can give you that information, so then you can assess how you need to train going forward to improve the qualities you need to have in order to run your fastest. And then lastly, like I said, we can use isometric testing to identify which joints of the body are not as strong as the rest, which leg is not as strong as the other, and then go and try to target those qualities so we can be as well built as possible for the demands of sprinting.